Just the fact that you chose to show up shows that you value probably learning history that maybe you weren't taught in high school. I was not taught this history in high school. And I attended a school that was 60% Native American. And so when your history is denied and you don't see yourself in textbooks and you don't hear about yourself in your class lessons, it impacts the way you view yourself, your family, your tribe, and your community. So that you all saw enough value in this presentation to show up, I thank you. Musab Ketcha, thank you. And this is where I was born and raised. I grew up in the Fort Klamath Valley. That fort was there at the time of the treaty signing to keep the Indians on their reservation. This image is actually taken out my parents' living room window, and we are fortunate to live on sacred ground. This is where the Klamath Treaty of 1864 was signed. This is Council Grove, and we get to see it every day that they look out their window. And so that's where I come from. That's my connection to the land and to my people. And I'm an enrolled member of the Klamath Tribe with Klamath and Modoc. And to do this presentation, I had to learn quite a bit about the Paiute, because I am not an enrolled member of the Paiute tribe, and it's mostly the Paiute that were in this area. The Klamath Trail ran from the Klamath and Modoc area down kind of basically what is present-day Highway 97 was the Klamath Trail. And it would go up to the great trading grounds at Celila Falls, so up on the Columbia. And so there is a history of Wasco natives coming down and of Klamath natives coming up through the area, but it is primary Paiute territory. And the Paiutes, when it came time for treaties, they were very dispersed. And you might not know very many Paiute history because the history is not very well written. But you've probably heard of Ochiko. That's named after Chief Ochiko, a Paiute. Chief Palina, a Paiute. Chief Winnemucca, a Paiute. Chief Choctaw, a Paiute. And Chief Wiwa, a Paiute. Those 5 chiefs all went to 5 different reservations in 3 different states. So that's how diverse the Paiute are. The Paiute controlled 1/3 of what is present-day Oregon. And so when we say there was some Paiute here, there was different bands of Paiute throughout the area, as well as Wasco Klamath, and originally some Molalla Indians that eventually ended up on the other side of the mountain. But I'm just going to give you a general overview of who used to live here and some of the current issues that tribes are facing today. And so this map shows you, this line right here kind of depicts that Klamath Trail. And then going up to the top is the Celilo Falls and the Celilo Trading Grounds. But this is what Indian country used to look like. And you'll notice how diverse it is. There are today over 574 different federally recognized tribes. And a lot of those tribes back in the day are no longer present today. And so that's how diverse Indian country was. And so when I talk about different tribes, I think it's important to give you a foundation each tribe. And we can learn a lot about the people, just like we can learn about the people of Sunriver by where they live and how they live. And so these are some pictures of some Paiute houses. And so the Paiute being more so from central and eastern Oregon, they would frequently have either a mat housing or a tule housing or sagebrush housing in a wickiup form. The standard wickiup would be about 8 to 14 feet in diameter, and they would be a somewhat temporary house. And the Paiute are unique in that if you think about, if we got in our car and we just drove directly east, once we got about 50 to 100 miles in that direction, what if we needed to eat? If we weren't at Silver Lake, where are we going to stop and eat? And I'm talking about today. There's no restaurant, so you get the Burns. Get to Fields Junction and have a burger and a shake. So it was the same back 100, 200 years ago. So the average Paiute, for one Paiute person, they needed 10 to 20 miles to feed that one person because the area was not food dense. And so the Paiute would keep in small bands. And so the standard Paiute band would only be about 3 to 7 families. And so that's why the Paiute are so diverse and why they are spread in so many different places. But this is their typical housing. Then if you go a little bit further south, you have the Klamath and their housing. And they get more into the tool mat housings because we were on the marsh areas, and so we would have a lot of toolies. And then if you go a little bit further south, you would see the pit houses of the Modoc and the Klamath people. And if you go outside right now, you see this thing called snow. And so these people would deal with a lot harsher weather and a lot more snow. And so they found if they dug down about 2 to 3 feet, then that would insulate them from the cold weather, yet in the summer it was cool. And so they would have the pit houses, and then they would also put sod on their houses. But this is the Klamath people. And then the last one I'm going to touch on is the Warm Springs people. And the Warm Springs people are fairly different in that at the time of pre-contact, about 90% of their diet was fish and berries and roots. Where the Paiute, for example, they would eat a plethora of things because they didn't have a steady food source such as salmon. And so the Paiute would, or the Warm Springs would have more long-term housing, especially up at the fishing grounds, where they would catch and bring in salmon, and then they wouldn't want to pack all of that fish, so they would have huge houses where they would dry fish and smoke fish to keep for a long time. And so they would have larger structures. And this almost looks like a plains teepee. It resembles that. They wouldn't use buffalo hides. This one's actually made of canvas. The photo was taken around I think I have it in my notes. This photo was taken in 1805 at the mouth of the John Day. And so this may have actually been a ceremonial tent or a cooking tent because it is larger. And the salmon people were able to sustain larger populations because they had more food. And so their groups would get up to a couple of hundred people in a band. Unlike the Paiute, that would maybe have 20, 30 people in a band. And so as you can see, our housing reflected our culture. And I've talked around it, but one of the main things that our culture is based off is our first foods. And so if we walked out this door, we would find a pine tree. One small handful of pine nuts has 18 grams of protein in it. And so first foods were essential to staying alive and to surviving. That was your daily task. To one, get enough calorie intake to make it to the next day, and then to preserve food so that you could make it through the winter. And so pine nuts are a very small part of that we all still see every day. And then this happens to be a seasonal round. And what this goes to is it goes to that the tribes in this area did not have permanent housing. And it's because there was never enough food in one place for them to stay there all year round. They were all hunter-gatherers. They were not necessarily horticulturists like tribes that are further east. And so a seasonal round is how tribes lived. They would travel with the seasons and follow the food. So some foods that you may find in this area would be like camas, deer, beaver, waterfowl. All of those things they would find in this area, and they would follow that food. And the food defines our language, defines our lifestyle, and defines our culture. And so these are 4 different types of food. This is the camas root. Or no, this is the camas root over here. This is, does anybody know what this is? It's a water lily. It's called wokus. And this is a traditional food from my tribe. And if you take the water lily and you take off this pod, you can see there's some little seeds there. It reminds me of a quinoa seed, now that I know what quinoa is. But I used to call it like a sesame seed. And so you would take this pod, take it off, and you would dry that. And then you would take that seed, you would take the pod, and they would have big rocks, big flat rocks, and they would have a stone. And they would take this pod that was dried, and they would, it's called, in our language, it's called woksabeksa. They would grind that seed down and that pod down. And then they would transfer, they would have a mess of kind of a cornmeal, but a bunch of shells. So then they would transfer that meal onto a tool mat, and they would toss it in the air and say, woksabeksa, and the wind would take those little shells and push them off, and you would be left with a cornmeal. And this was a very healthy, calorie-rich little cornmeal that they were left with. And they would make it into a type of porridge. And the elders say that the top of the porridge was known, like if you had a cold or something, you would skim that top and it would make your throat feel better. And so that was our subsistence food. If you go further south, they did the same thing with corn. And then once the ration system came, that all got replaced with white flour. So not nearly as healthy. But that's what we relied on. This was our subsistence food. This is what carried us through the winters. And then this, how many of us have seen these cattails? There is an edible part of a cattail all year round. So not only the Pacific Northwest happens to be known for their basket weaving, specifically, I got to say, the Klamath Tribe, and some Northern California tribes are known to weave baskets so tight that they hold water. But they would use this instead of bear grass down where I'm from. Up here, the Warm Springs will use bear grass to weave baskets. But this is something we see every day that is edible and that they would use to eat. And then they also did big game hunting. And then this is a camas root. And so sometimes you'll be driving across the field and you'll see this over in the Willamette Valley. You'll see it out in John Day and Burns. But this is a prevalent root that you actually have to cook down. And if you don't cook it down long enough, like in a fire overnight in the ashes, it can be fairly toxic to your system. And you can get really bad gas and bloating. But when you do, who loves roasted garlic? Turns sweet? I love that stuff. That's what this is called. Margaret Seppa from the Warm Springs tribe says it's called Indian candy. And so those are just a couple things that we may drive by every day, but they are the foundation to the native culture because it's the first foods. And once you were able to harvest enough food, you could then have enough to trade. And I mentioned the great trading ground at Celilo Falls. And that trade there was so prolific that they have found arrows from Glass Butte here in Central Oregon, all the way down in Mexico and all the way on the East Coast. That's how those trade routes worked. And they found them up in Alaska. And so that's how prolific trading was. And so they would come together for a time while harvesting salmon, and it was a good time for marrying to have marriages, because you would want to marry somebody outside your tribe. And I got to give a shout out to the women. It was frequently the women that would leave the tribe. And so when it came to having issues with our language, oftentimes it is the women that restore the language because they would be bilingual, because they would know their language as well as their husband's language. And trading was so prolific in the Pacific Northwest that they created their own language. It's called Chinook Wawa, or Chinook jargon. And that jargon was used all throughout the Pacific Northwest. And so you never know what you're going to see and what is named after Native people. And so Lucy said, oh yeah, can you do some language? And I wanted to say, Lucy, you do know that my language is dead, because my language was extinct. There was this little thing that came about in 1887 called the boarding school system. And at that time, Native children were taken from their tribes and their families and put in boarding school. And it was forbidden for them to speak their language. A couple of examples of that is in World War I, there were some Choctaw soldiers. And they were speaking their language, and a higher-up heard them, and he said, hey, we could use that as a secret code. And so the Choctaw were the first code talkers in World War I. And a Choctaw soldier said the first word he learned in English was soap, because that's what he got his mouth washed out with when he talked Choctaw. And most people know about the Navajo code talkers during World War II. It's said that they're one of the main reasons why we were in the position we were on the Pacific Front. And they use that Navajo language as a secret code. To date, it is the only secret code that has never been broken. We broke Enigma, and we broke every other code except for the Navajo language. And the Navajo code talkers created a code within a code. It's called super ciphered. So that means even if you spoke Navajo and you heard what they were saying, you still couldn't decipher their code. Because they may say in Navajo over an open radio, because they didn't care if the Germans heard or the Japanese heard, they would say, you know, the eggs are in the basket on the way to the store. And unless you knew that eggs were bombs, and unless you knew that the basket was a B-52 bomber, you didn't know what that meant. And so the Navajo did a code within the code, and to date, it remains the only code that was unbroken. And a Navajo code talker says that when he was in boarding school, he got in trouble for speaking Navajo. He was tied to the radiator in the basement for 3 days and fed bread and water for speaking his language. And so when Lucy said, "Can you tell me some of the language words?" My language, the Klamath language, is extinct. Our last fluent speaker died in 1998, Eva Eggsman. And I always say my grandma went to boarding school at the age of 12. She was separated from her siblings, and she was sent to Lawrence, Kansas, and they were sent to Stewart Indian School. And she was a fluent speaker. She did not teach her children a single word of her language, or her grandchildren. And I always say that. And then I was doing some work on first foods, and I told them the story, and I said, oh, and they would grind it, and they would say, woksabexa, woksabexa. The only word she taught me in Klamath was related to first foods. And that's the only Klamath word she taught me. But it shows how closely related the language and the culture are to the foods and what they lived off of. You've probably driven by some of these places, and like it's hard to tell. Like if I look at Tumalo, the Klamath have a word for it, meaning wild plums. That's where they would go to pick wild plums. And so when I talked to the Klamath Culture and Heritage Department, they're like, yeah, Central Oregon's our area. Tumalo means wild plum. That means we've been there. And then I called over the Burns Paiute tribe, and they're like, oh, no, Central Oregon is our area. I was like, okay. I called up to the Warm Springs tribe, and they're like, oh, no, Central Oregon's our area. So they all claimed it as their own. But I think it's because they all also contain groups of Paiutes. But if you look at Tumalo, it also means foggy or icy water in Warm Springs. And so they both laid claim to that, and their language proves that they were both there. Another one that you may see, Metolius means smelly place. And that's because the fish would go up there and spawn, and then they would stink. I don't know why in Chinook jargon the beautiful Lake Cultus means bad and worthless. Maybe they were saying that to keep people out of there? I don't know. I found this one really interesting, hooch, that it actually comes from a Tlingit word and was used in Chinook jargon. So I'm assuming hooch was a hotly traded commodity up at Celilo Falls. Tillicum, and Ben, there's a Tillicum village. At Southern Oregon University, they have a camp called Conaway Nicotilicoms. It means gather my friends and family. And so the language is very present here. In just Oregon, there are over 27 different native languages. If we look out of our 32 counties, we have Klamath, Wasco, Clatsop, Coos, Umpqua, Umatilla, Walla Walla, Multnomah, Clackamas, and Tillamook, all of which are either tribal people or tribal names. We have rivers like the Umpqua, the Siuslaw, peaks like Paulina Peak. So the native language is all around us. Getting it translated is the tricky part. Because again, we have a language department for our tribe, but we're having to bring those languages back from the brink of extinction. And I do want to say that COCC and Madras both offer languages classes in Wasco, and I think there's maybe Tino, I can't remember, but they do offer language classes as bringing back those languages. But it ties us together in our trade jargon and the words that we use. And then Big Meadow was specifically spoken about by several of the tribes I researched, because it was so well known as a place to rest. If you were coming up the Klamath Trail, or if you were coming over from the east side of Oregon, they would frequently stop here in this area in Big Meadow to graze. So if they were bringing horses up to trade, they would stop and graze their horses here. And so this was known as a place to stop that was safe, where they could fish. There's one story of fishing taking place here on the Deschutes River, and they caught over 300 fish in an afternoon. And so that's how abundant these resources were right here in this area. This is actually a painting of the northern Paiute, and it was done by, I'm not sure of the artist, but it was procured by the Sunriver Nature Center. And it has a native gentleman fishing. It shows the wickiup, which would have been typical for this type of area, and then a lady cooking and a child. But again, this is specific to Sunriver. Something that I keep talking about are our first foods. And when I transition from the past to the present, those first foods will stay with us because they're so instrumental to the native culture. And so what happened was treaties started being signed, and there was Indian force removal starting about the 1800s, and it got to the Pacific Northwest about the 1850s. And the Klamath signed our treaty in 1864. And we ceded about 20 million acres. This red line is our traditional roaming area. The blue line is our agreed upon reservation. And then the green line is what our reservation ended up being. This one over here is the Warm Spring Reservation. They ceded over 10 million acres and received a reservation of about 640,000 acres. And so this one was the Treaty of Middle Oregon for Warm Springs and Wasco, and then the Treaty of the Klamath Lakes. And this is Warm Springs, Wasco, and Paiutes. This is Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin Band of Snake Indians, which are Paiutes. And the first article in almost any treaty in the Pacific Northwest, as well as back east. Back east is different because they signed multiple treaties. In the Pacific Northwest, we usually only signed one. But the first line says that Native tribes have the exclusive right of hunting and taking fish in the streams and lakes, and they preserve this right. And Native people today are very adamant. This right was not bestowed upon us. We never gave it up. And so I talked about the first foods and about the housing, and all of it is tied to our ability to hunt, fish, and gather, because it's who we are to be a part of this land. And so to have this be the #1 thing in almost every treaty shows its value. This specific image is Native people in the present day harvesting lamprey. Over 1 million lamprey used to go over the Bonneville Dam every year. Within 30 years, that is down to 20,000. And now the only place where you can harvest lamprey, which was a subsistence food for almost every tribe in this corridor, the 97 corridor, the only place you can catch enough lamprey in numbers is at Willamette Falls. And that's where this family is harvesting fish. And this is a Klamath lady harvesting wokus. And these are two Klamath lady they're a sucker fish, but we call them chwam and koptu. And they're bottom feeder fish, but they were a staple for us. They were the salmon. We used to have salmon in our rivers, but we haven't had salmon for a long time. But we did basically survive on this high protein fish. It's not as high in protein as a good salmon, but that was our subsistence food, and hunting and fishing was extremely important. And this is a map of land loss. So when I said we were signing treaties, this was treaty time. Does this look like, does anybody know what these two reservations are? Or even this one? Okay. We're all fairly familiar with this map because this is what it currently looks like. But we have this issue during treaty days. This is a Malheur Indian reservation. It doesn't exist. This is the Coast Indian Reservation, and it doesn't exist. So what happened is natives would sign a treaty, and they would cede land, and they would agree to things. They would agree to things like, okay, you get 6 school teachers, you get a blacksmith shop, you get this many rations promised you on this date. That's how specific the treaties were. And so the natives would agree to it, they would sign, and then they would be removed to their reservations. The coastal reservation removed all of these natives all through here, all across the valley. There's stories of parents swimming the Umpqua and the Sayusla with their children on their back, and soldiers forcing them up the coast. If you go to Yachats, there's a trail called Amanda's Trail, where a blind woman was forced to march, and you could see her bloody feet prints. going up the coast. And so they went to their reservation and they signed their treaty, just like the Malheur did. And the treaties were never passed by Congress, and so they were null and void. So they were removed from their land and they never got their treaty rights. And so that's why this map looks different. And then this about 2 million acres looks different too, due to another public federal government policy called termination that I'm going to touch on in a minute. But this is what Indian country in Oregon looks like today. You see just these little dots, and that's because we are landless, or we're buying back lands at 100 acres or 1,000 acres at a time. The two big reservations are the Umatilla and the Warm Springs. But if you look from here to here, that's a pretty big difference, a couple million acres. And then these places like Fort McDermott, this is where there's a bunch of Paiute here, but their reservation is in another state. And you also see that over here. And the easiest way to know whose reservation or whose territory you're currently in is, what casino do you see there? And again, that's a treaty right. Gaming was not given to us. That was something that we retained, was our civil rights. And gaming is one of those. And this is a brief overview, and I did it specific to the Klamath Tribes, just because that's where I'm from. But this happened all across the nation. You would sign your treaty, and then specifically, the Plains Tribes did this, and then in the Pacific Northwest, this happened. The Indians wouldn't stay on their reservations. And so we happened to have the Modoc War. But you may notice a gentleman named Chief Joseph. He was about 1877. He refused to go to the Lapwai Reservation, got within 40 miles of the Canadian border before he was caught by the US Army. Sitting Bull did the same thing around 1890. Geronimo was captured in 1886, but these are all examples of natives who did not stay on their reservations and basically paid the ultimate price for refusing to do so. Then after your Indian Wars, you get into forced assimilation, and that's when native reservations started being allotted out into private farmland. And what would happen is each head of household would be given about 160 acres, and they were to become farmers. And then any land that was left over after allotment was deemed surplus land and given to white residents. And given or sold, both. And then this is also when the boarding schools came about. And then nobody really knows about the Indian offenses. The Indian offenses under the Dawes Act made it illegal for you to practice Native American ceremony. It became illegal to drum, to dance, to have your burial ceremonies or your marriage ceremonies. And this stayed illegal until the Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1987. And so that was the direct attack on the culture. That's why people don't know the dances, they don't know the language, and they don't know the songs. It's because it was outlawed. And then in 1934, we had a shift in thinking. We had the Indian Reorganization Act. And this act said, we want tribes to be able to govern themselves. But you need to set up your government like ours so that we know what you're doing. And so that's why my tribe has a constitution, has bylaws. We practice parliamentary procedure, which they try to drill into my head that I can't interrupt. But that's why we do those things, is because of the Indian Reorganization Act. Tribal governments are fashioned after that of the United States. But then, like if you look at Warm Springs, they kept some of their traditions, and they have 3 chiefs as part of their tribal government. We have 6 members at large that are just elected from our body to represent the people's issues. But this was a turning point because Native Americans started getting a say in their affairs. But then something really bad happened, and that was termination. In 1954, the federal government decided they would get out of the Indian business for good, and they would terminate the rights of tribes, and they would disregard those treaties. And I tell you about it not just because the Klamath tribe was targeted, but because Oregon was targeted as a whole. Out of the 109 tribes that were terminated across the nation, 62 of them were located in Oregon. What do we have in Oregon that the federal government would want? Timber. The Klamath had the second largest timber stand in the nation. The Menominee of Wisconsin had the first largest timber stand. Both were terminated. And so we sold everything down to the last stapler. If you ever wondered where the Fremont Wainema forest came from, that was the Klamath Reservation. And so we were terminated, and we were terminated for 30 years. So there's a 30-year gap where you were no longer an enrolled member of the Klamath Tribes. And that was a tough gap because it broke the links that bound you. You had your familial family, but you didn't have your political nation, you didn't have your businesses together, and you were no longer a tribe. There was nothing that held you together. It's kind of like a company being dissolved or a family being dissolved through divorce. And so we were actually restored in 1986, and this was after a lot of work. And different tribes such as Siletz and Grand Ronde were both restored around the same time. But when we were restored in the Restoration Act, it says that this act provides that nothing in this act shall affect any hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, or the rights of any tribe. So when you saw the Klamath Reservation disappear, that was due to termination. And so I had the pleasure over last summer to be able to interview 20 different tribal elders. And I was writing some curriculum for the state of Oregon, and we wanted to hear what the elders had to say. And you know, a pandemic that targets the elderly makes you kind of shut up and listen to them because they have a lot to say and they're really smart. And so I had the privilege of interviewing them, and I talked to them about the boarding schools, and they kept it together. And I talked to them about termination, and oh, they hurt. You could basically see the blood on the floor, but they would keep it together. And this wasn't this summer, this was last summer. And then they would talk about their land. And we were doing this interview in July. The bootleg fire that year was about 150,000 acres. We almost canceled the interviews because we didn't want our elders to be breathing so much smoke. We didn't know at that time that that fire would get over to over 400,000 acres. We knew that the 242 fire the year before had burnt down our old tribal headquarters. And it was the tribe's dream to buy that back because we were the second wealthiest tribe in the nation at the time of termination. And our headquarters were beautiful. I mean, it had like white picket fences and these beautiful buildings, and the tribe always wanted to buy that back, and that was burnt down the year before. And so my elders would start to talk about their land and about fishing and hunting, and their voices would crack. And they could talk about being beaten as a child, they could talk about being terminated as a tribe, but they couldn't talk about their land without emotion. And so when I tell you that there's things that tie us together, that land ties us together. And I have a video of my elders talking about healing the land and how if we do that, we believe that it will heal the people as well. And I'd like to share that with you.
I mean, I've shared the water, the air, the land, the chemicals that make up my body are the same as the land, the trees, the plums, the chokecherries. You have to understand, growing up in the land raised you to be who you are.
My grandma, she would feed us from the land. She'd say, pick this, pick this. I mean, we never was hungry. And she always knew where the water was. Always where the spring was, she always knew where all that was.
As for our tribe being the very first environmentalist, we had an old saying, you never took all the eggs out of a single nest and all the berries off of a single bush. You know, we take what we need. We don't take everything. But that mindset isn't shared with a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans will take it till it's gone. Then what?
Hearing the stories growing up from all of the elders that surrounded me, being able to walk across these rivers that are full of salmon, the lamprey, the marshes that don't even exist anymore, the lakes that have been drained for agriculture, and now we struggle to to collect and harvest our wokus, our chwam and koptu we can't even eat anymore. They're on the endangered species list. We get annual notices when the lake becomes too toxic to touch.
They need respect for the animals that we eat. And a lot of them, like the fish, are gone.
I know I'm not the only tribal member that is grieving for our land and for the loss of not just the trees, but all the animals. It's devastating. So I know when I leave here, I know I'll go to the lake and I'll offer a song for what we're losing.
It's sad because right now our reservation is burning up. And so, you know, where the hunting and fishing and gathering rights, when there's nothing out there to hunt, nothing out there to gather, and through what happens after a fire, the erosion and all the sediment in the water, how good's the fishing going to be?
Klamath Basin can be a home base. It is and if we rebuild it the way it should be, fresh water, fresh trees, forest management. If we could see Oregon State Wildlife to realize that the tribal subsistence hunting rights cannot be sustained if they keep overhunting our old reservation.
We need to have these radical beliefs that there are better days forward for us. We have this space where reclamation and restoration of our lands and of the ways, the life ways that have tied us to these lands can take us forward, can inform the future of policy, can restore balance to these lands and hopefully undo the legacies of violence that we have exposed these lands to for the last 150 years.
We've been here for tens of thousands of years. I want our people in the future to continue to maintain their relationship to the land and those resources that come from the land, because those are resources and those lands are so ingrained in our culture, our traditions, our values.
You cannot separate a native from their land. There's no way. You may say we don't own it anymore, but it is still ours. And I believe it will be ours again.
That last picture is my three aunties. So I just have to end with that. And this is my aunt. She's the one that said, we will own that land again. This is us out huckleberry picking. We sent it out to our family group, and they all said, you guys will not survive the winter, was their comment back to us, that we hadn't picked enough. But we are reclaiming our land, we're reclaiming our culture, and we're reclaiming our history. And one of those ways that we're doing that is through land stewardship. And some of the current issues that we are fighting against have to do with things that are going on throughout the Pacific Northwest. And those are wildfire and drought. And the Klamath Basin has been hit specifically hard with drought. And we have the Klamath Tribes on one side of the issue and the Endangered Species Act. Our chwam and koptu that used to number in the millions are down to 30,000. And they are the bottom feeder. These fish can live till they're 60. They are tough fish. and they are dying. And so it's an indicator species that shows you if we don't change something, nothing will survive. And on the other side, we have the Klamath Project farmers and irrigators. And I don't want to talk negatively about these people because they don't just feed Klamath County and Oregon, they feed the nation with the crops that they grow. And as a Native person, I want to show empathy to them. Because Native people have been forced to change the way we lived. We went to boarding school and had a new way of life forced upon us. We had the reservation system forced upon us. We had been living that way for 100 years, and we were forced to change. These farmers have been living this way for 100 years, and they were promised water, and they are being forced to change. They are losing their lifestyle. So as Native people, we know what that's like, and we should have empathy for what they're going through. But that doesn't mean that it's not a hotly contested issue, because it is. And tribes are on the forefront of restoration projects. River restoration after fires. The Warm Springs is doing amazing things on the Deschutes, the John Day, all with restoration in mind for salmon runs. And so tribes are on the forefront of this issue and hold a pretty big piece because, you know, the Warm Springs land is probably one of the largest landowners in Oregon. And so that's a big deal. And frequently when I do these talks, I have people ask, well, what can I do? And to show allyship, you can show up. You guys all did that. You showed value in just showing up. You can recognize that Native education and Native history is important. You could support Natives who are reconnecting. And that may be a Native trying to learn their language, attending an online Zoom class to do that. Or somebody growing out their hair and reconnecting that way. You can understand that Native tribes and communities are healing. And then if you have not heard this history, ask why not. If you haven't heard of the boarding schools, why is that? Over 83% of Native children were in boarding schools in 1896. Why didn't you know that? And they went on for over 100 years. And for my Native people, we often hear about trauma. But don't forget that you're the descendants of those that survived. You are strong. And other people will ask, well, what else can we do? And the Klamath Tribes and the Warm Springs Tribes actually are in the position where both of them have funds set up. The AMBO fund goes directly to water restoration, creek restoration, and buying back property for the Klamath Tribes. The Church fund for the Warm Springs Tribe goes directly to getting them clean drinking water, which they do not have. And then in closing, I want to thank the people that I was able to talk to. It was great to hear everybody I talked to said, that's our area. They all wanted to claim this beautiful piece of land as their own. And it was their own at a time. But now it's yours, and you're in charge of the stewardship of that. And then these are some of the sources that I used. The Deschutes Historical Society was extremely helpful, as were all three tribes. But it was great to learn more about the history here in Sunriver. And then I have some additional resources up here. This Mill Creek restoration is really cool for the Warm Springs Tribe and some of the land that they're doing to restore riverbanks. But Moosap Ketcha, thank you very much for coming and letting me speak to you.
Thank you so much. I don't think it's good enough for us to say thank you. I'm the language enthusiast that she was talking about earlier, so I think she should teach us to say thank you in Klamath.
It's sup ketchup, but if you mean lots of thanks, you say moose up ketchup or moose up ketchup. It's really good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was a terrific question.
Thank you. If you had any questions, I'm happy to. Yes, sir.
The history of the horses I'm kind of interested in because obviously the Spanish introduced them, and you said they were so very important to the native peoples. About what time period how did it come that the natives were able to get the horses?
The horses are considered sacred. That's when Captain Jack had enough of the reservation, was when he was forced to eat his horse, and that's when he left, because you don't eat a horse. But the horses were originally introduced to the Comanche. And the Comanche are the greatest, known as the greatest horsemen in the world. And they basically kept the Spaniards from coming north as a mounted cavalry. They are the reason that the pistol was introduced. Why the Texas Rangers created the pistol was to hunt the Comanche, because they would outmaneuver them with a bow and arrow on a horse, is how good they were. And so then the horses came forth. And the reason why, like the Malala were moved out of this area was because the Paiutes were mounted and they were not. And so the horses didn't initially survive for like the Klamath. We're right below Crater Lake. You were getting 10 feet of snow and those horses weren't surviving the winters. And again, they're not going to eat their horse. And so you'll notice that the horses stayed more in the plains. In Oregon, it was the Paiute and the Cayuse. Cayuse means horse. They are known for their Appaloosa breeding and their Cayuse horses up there. I don't have a specific timeline for you, but that's why Chief Joseph was so successful. That's why the Spanish didn't come up, was because of the Comanche and the Kiowa were so well mounted. And they would go out in the plains and they would do things with horses that you can't imagine. There's a book, I think it's called Comanche Son, but it talks about how instrumental the horse were and how they would literally, you know, it's not just in movies, they would hang off the side of the horse and they could shoot 6 arrows faster than a soldier could reload their gun. And they would shoot it underneath the neck of the horse. And so Indian rodeo is huge. Just about 2 weeks ago, they had the national finals, and it's the National Indian Rodeo Finals. And so all contestants are enrolled tribal members. And, you know, Pendleton, if you can go up there, has a great history of Native Americans and horses. My dad is a rancher and native horseman. I had a friend, my husband's from the Middle East, and his cousin from Saudi Arabia was coming to the United States for the first time. And he wanted to meet an Indian and a cowboy and see a waterfall. Those were his 3 wishes. I sent him to Multnomah Falls and I introduced him to my dad because he was an Indian cowboy. But yeah, the horses are so interesting, and I don't have specific dates, but the most mounted were the Paiute, and then the Cayuse breed their own line of horses and everything. Cayuse and Matilla. Great question. I want to learn more.
I thought there had been legislation, I don't know if it's federal or state, where there's a package that will, every teacher in grades through K through 12, and every grade will be taught history of Native Americans.
Booyah, that is called Senate Bill 13, passed in 2016. And at the end of that video, you saw that it was paid for by Tribal History, Shared History. That's where the funding came from to write the curriculum. This is the link to the Klamath Tribes curriculum. The Oregon Department of Education did something amazing. Not only did the state decide that we should teach Native history, the Oregon Department of Education told the tribes to write their own history and give them the money to do that. And so I give a presentation on boarding schools. And I thought I know boarding schools, you know, I teach history. That history had never been written. We didn't even have a list of all of our tribal members that had gone to boarding school. And so writing that curriculum uncovered the history, and that's why I was interviewing those 20 elders, was for that curriculum. And I have links to all of our videos here that we did with that Senate Bill 13 funding. So yes, they did pass it, and we are doing it, and I love it, absolutely love it. I was at Bend High last week. So, yes?
Can you tell me your name again, please?
My name is Gabrielle Hall. Abby is a nickname and what most people call me. I'm a Mitchell, is my grandma's name, and the name of the treaty signer that I'm a descendant of. And then we're also related to the Kirks and the Millers.
Thank you.
Yeah. There was a question? Yeah.
I know Klamath River starts in California, and there's been things going on with the water, and the people that raise the grapes in California want water, and the Indians need water. And I was wondering if they've come to an agreement.
Not at all. So the Klamath River, it starts with the Yurok, the Hupa, the Karuk, and the Klamath. And so that's who's along that river. And when we make the call, because we have the superior water right, we make the call knowing that we're killing the farmers and that we're killing the salmon for the 3 lower river tribes. And we've made that call every year on the water. This year, the Bureau of Land Reclamation decided not to follow their own formula and to allot more water to the farmers, knowing that it would kill the fish. And so how do you decide what's more important? I don't think they can, and that's why they can't come to an agreement. I can tell you the Klamath Tribes sued the Bureau of Land Reclamation for not following their formula and for releasing the water. So yeah, and it's multiple tribe, and it's tribe against tribe, and it's Chwam and Koptu against salmon, and then you throw in the food we all eat. We all eat potatoes out of that valley, and so it's very contentious. Yes?
I thought the dam was supposed to be coming down off of that.
It is supposed to be coming down. This is supposed to be the largest remaking of a wetland that has ever been undertaken, larger than the Florida Everglades. And so it's in the works. And we like to, if you watch Killing the Klamath, or you watch our elementary version of Killing the Klamath, Saving the Chwam, it addresses all of these issues. But I think something that's overlooked is everybody can agree it doesn't rain as much and it doesn't snow as much. And we can't change that. And so that's the foundation of the problem. When there's enough water, there's no issues, but there hasn't been enough water for a really long time. And so there's constant issues, and it's violent. My tribe was doing a prayer run. It's called Run for the Stronghold, and they recreate that run from Fort Klamath where the Modoc left, 68 Modoc left, and they ran for the lava beds, which is right on the other side of the California border. And my tribe does that every October. And this year they were shot at. And it was men, women, and children doing a prayer run, and they were shot at. And nothing has been done in Klamath County. And so I want to proceed with empathy, but don't shoot at people when they're doing a prayer run. Don't shoot at people, period. But it's very, very contentious because people are losing their livelihood. And that's personal. There was a question over here. Oh, okay. Yeah.
One last thing. If I wanted to better understand the relationships between the tribes, to include, conflict, stuff like that, is there any source to that?
The tribes all have these amazing web pages, and every one of them have newsletters that come out. And then there's intertribal things that relate to things like education, government-to-government meetings. Powwows are intertribal. That's where a bunch of people come together and celebrate together, and they're from multiple different tribes. Like my tribe, we have several tribal members that practice a grass dance. A grass dance is traditionally a plains dance, yet we've reconnected that culture and made it our own. And so powwows are a great way to see a bunch of different tribes together. And then for the first time this April, the tribes, all 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, got together for a water ceremony. And they don't usually do that sort of thing, but they're realizing that we're all facing similar issues, such as fires, such as water issues, restoration projects, and they're coming together to, I saw what Warm Springs was doing, and I shared it with my tribe. I stole the production company, which is out of Bend, Wahoo Films is who made that film, and I saw the great work they were doing with Warm Springs. And so we do communicate, and I think we're great at seeing somebody did something awesome, and so making it our own and reworking it. So we're not reinventing the wheel and doing those sorts of things. And then we do definitely come together on things like healthcare, because we all are under the umbrella of the Indian healthcare system, IHS. And so those things are very united, but each tribe has a web page, and those web pages are great resources. Current events, history, different departments. If you're specifically interested in culture and heritage, each tribe has that department. If you're interested in natural resources, each tribe has that department. And it's amazing what these tribes have. You can go to the field trip with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, or you can go tour Warm Springs facilities, or if you tour our facilities, they have fish rearing ponds and all the technology that all the other major people have, and they do it on a smaller level, so you can get in and talk to them. So yeah, I would highly recommend the web pages of any tribe.
And I thought there were programs to bring back the lamprey.
To bring back what?
The lamprey.
I'm not sure about any specific program. Right now, we're hoping with the dams coming out that, you know, my tribe's like, when are we getting back salmon? And so those programs in restoration are in place to help that to happen. But I don't know specifically about the lamprey.
I can also say, though, it took 2 years once those dams came down for the salmon to start running up. They were amazing.
Yeah, I think we're all just kind of waiting to see what happens. And that should be in the near future. Yeah.
Do all of the, Warm Springs has the casino. That's a good source of revenue. When you say that the different tribes want to buy back land, how do they go about doing it? What is their source of revenue?
I donated $20 to the AMBO fund. They go about it in different ways. Tribes such as Grand Ronde. Grand Ronde has a very successful casino. They're right next to Portland. They have money to buy things. We apply for the Grand Ronde grants, my tribe does. But we do it through different, some people donate land back. Things like nature conservatories will donate land back. The problem with donated land is sometimes it comes with strings attached. But again, in the last year, we have bought about 4,000 acres. And I was so stoked. And so I made this map for one of my lessons. And I wanted to put back the land that we've been buying back, because we've bought back about 5,000 acres. And I was so excited to show this just go down. And then I wanted to show it build back up. And so I got all of our acreage put together. And I wanted to put it in the simulation. And you couldn't see it on the map because it was so bad. But I felt like we were doing so good. You know, we had like 5,000 acres. But it was so small it didn't show up on the map. And so that's how they're doing it. They're just literally doing it, you know, one piece of property at a time. And that's how the Klamath Tribes doing it. I'm not really sure how other tribes are doing it. You know, like the Siletz is buying back land. I think everybody's trying to. At Burns Warm Spring, I think, Burns has a great argument, I think, to get back the Malheur Refuge. That was theirs. They agreed to it. They signed for it. And due to the Bannock War, they didn't ratify the treaty. I think that's justified. I think we're justified in either asking for a sale or having the Fremont Wainema Forest restored to us. I think it's a solid ask. Will we get it? I don't know. But yeah, it's literally a piece of property at a time. We'll buy things small as half an acre. Thank you.